So this is part two of plant establishment. Before I offer some comments, I wanted to mention a couple very nice Canadian references on canola production. And the first one is a website called Canola Encyclopedia. And it seems to be a wonderful site, lots of details on all aspects of canola production. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And the second one is Canola Digest. It's an electronic reference. Really, it's the electronic magazine, and you notice under issues that there is a current issue out just this month. So between the two, I think it's a real nice supplement to the information that NDSU Extension has. So my topics are very simple. First, I want to talk a little bit about crop sequencing or rotations and a bit on field selection. And then I want to spend some time on stand evaluation. So I captured this table from the Canadian references, looking at canola's response to the previous crop. And the boxes that are in blue would indicate a positive response. And this is based on actually 7 years of surveying commercial fields in Manitoba. And so you notice that there's a number of grass crops preceding canola, as well as some broadleaf crops where canola responds quite nicely. As an example, notice corn. We show canola had a 10% yield increase following corn. And also notice with soybean, there was a modest yield response with canola following that crop as well. In North Dakota and Northwest Minnesota, there was some work done looking at crop sequences a few years back. They included either 7 or 8 site years of data, looking at canola response following either wheat or soybean, and then also looking at soybean response following canola as compared to wheat. And so I did a very simple compilation in graph form showing the average across the site years. And so if we begin with canola response, that'd be the yellow bars. Notice that when canola yield following soybean was similar to canola following wheat. And then if we look at the soybean yield response, when it followed canola, again, the yield response is very similar to soybean that followed wheat. Keep in mind that, at least in the North Dakota trials, there is very minimal disease, and that's always a factor on this. So anyway, common rotations that we have involving canola look pretty positive when we include small grain and in particular soybean. So a few field considerations. Everyone's concerned about soil moisture as we move into springtime. And so we just want to do all we can to conserve soil moisture, especially near the soil surface because, of course, of our shallow planting of canola. And so anything we can do to preserve that moisture, maybe it's just minimizing tillage. And I know most people will plant their small grain ahead of canola, but maybe this is a year where we need to reverse that and consider planting canola ahead of our small grain. On soil properties, I want to talk a little bit about salt tolerance, but I'll do that with the next slide. And then certainly we want to consider disease and weed impacts on prior crops before canola for growing it this year, as well as after. As an example, if we have dry bean or sunflower in the rotation with canola, it certainly increases our risk of having sclerotinia in our canola in 2021. And how do we do on weed management in prior crops leading up to this coming season? We did a good job. We still need to be on our toes, but maybe a little less so. But so that's a consideration as well. And then how about after this year's canola? We definitely can count on some volunteers. And so that might have, that will be a factor to consider as we plan the crops to follow the canola. This is a very nice publication that was recently revised. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at that for whatever crops you have in your rotations on your farms. But looking specifically at canola, note that in the table, there is a threshold, and it's based on electrical conductivity. So for canola, the threshold is 1.5. So in the neighborhood of that measurement is where we'd expect the tolerance level would be. Granted, even below that, there could be some very minor loss of canola growing on salt-affected soil. But what I'm getting at here is, notice as we move from 1.5 to 2, the estimates are that a 10% yield reduction can occur just from that slight movement from 1.5 to 2, and then so on. So really, what's practical about this, you know those problem spots in a particular field. It'd be very good to soil test those, know exactly what the EC is, and then, gosh, if it's above 1.5, it'd be very good not to plant canola in those. Plant some other, ideally some other cash crop, maybe barley. And if a particular field has a substantial amount of this acreage that's salt affected, if there's choices on other fields to go to with canola, that would be good. And hopefully that'll be a practical choice. Okay, moving on to stand. Brian did a nice job about talking about some factors to optimize our stand, but as often happens, we don't get that optimum stand, something less. And I listed some potential causes. The list certainly isn't complete. The first couple of factors are related to seeding time, and then as the shoot emerges through the soil. And then the last two, flea beetle damage and frost, of course, would be concerns once those seedlings emerge. And I like to spend a little time with frost as an example. So earlier there's a question about minimum soil temperature for seed germination. According to literature, it's about 38 degrees. So how about seedling tolerance to frost? The literature states that in the mid-20s seems to be the threshold level, but there's variances there, certainly. It may depend on the number of hours that we're at a certain temperature, such as 28 or 29 degrees for 1 hour versus 3 or 4 hours. Or if we would have subsequent evenings, early mornings with low temps, that has an impact as well. And then if the plants emerge and we're exposed to quite cool temperatures, that may allow them to be hardened and to even be more tolerant of low temperatures. And then certainly with high residue levels, we know that the residue will hold the cold temps present longer. And so there may be more risk as our residue levels go up with canola production. Well, ultimately, we want people to be patient. And sometimes that's really hard, I know, but if we can wait for several days, even 5 to 7 days after the cold occurrence, that'd be important to see if the plant is going to recover. And so this is a nice picture that was shared by Brian Hansen of frost-affected canola. The cotyledons, of course, look terrible, but if you look closely, you'll see that there's regrowth occurring. And so that's what we'd expect much of the time. And so the next information I have is questions. And I don't have answers for them. It's just questions to consider as you contemplate a less than optimum stand. So first is, what's your acceptable minimum plant density? Is it 4 plants per square foot? Or maybe it's half of that. Or maybe it's half again. Maybe even 1 plant per square foot is sufficient if everything else is right. A question is a stand relatively uniform? And in most cases, I suspect not. Are established plants healthy? We would hope that be the case, and that certainly will help us on a low density stand. And growth stages, more than likely there's going to be a lot of variability there. How about weed and insect competition? Certainly as that density of canola plants goes down, it's going to give the opportunity for weeds and insects to be more of a negative factor for us. And then how about time of seeding? If we need to reseed, and it really is important, what part of the season is it? Is it still early yet where where reseeding might be viable, versus if it's late, if it's in central North Dakota and it's mid-June, reseeding probably is not going to be practical at all. And then some challenges with low plant density, obviously reduced yield potential. We're going to have variable growth stages, and that's going to be a hindrance to properly applying some post-emergence pesticides, such as fungicides for reducing sclerotinia, or herbicides for post-emergence weed control, in particular at harvest time. That's going to be the biggest challenge, is dealing with these variable growth stages. We also expect extended maturity due primarily to extensive branching as plant density goes down. Brian showed some of this in his presentation. So our concern is that instead of having the main stems and primary branches containing the bulk of the seed, it's moving to secondary branches. And so it just extends the period of seed development and provides those associated challenges. And then finally, with extended maturity, it just increases the potential of frost hitting us as we approach harvest. Certainly, we would expect more immature seed, shriveled seed, higher chlorophyll levels, and ultimately be aware of a reduced yield and possibly market grades.